The British GP at Silverstone brought us everything an F1 fan could have wanted. From mixed weather conditions to a shuffled finishing grid. From the moment the lights went out, we had it all. From Max Verstappen's safety car spin, to Oscar Piastri's controversial 10-second penalty that cost him the victory and closed the gap to the World Drivers' Championship, to Nico Hülkenberg securing his elusive maiden podium from P19 on the grid. Stay tuned as I break down all the key moments of this GP during one of the most exciting races of the season. Welcome back to another episode of the Grid Buzz podcast, where I will be doing my race review and breaking down all of the key moments in the British GP at Silverstone. We had it all during this GP, with mixed weather conditions shuffling the grid, causing a lot of chaos and just a lot of excitement and unexpected moments throughout the GP. There were some big winners and there were some big losers this weekend at Silverstone. And I am going to start out with my section on checkered flags and blue flags, which is my biggest winners and losers at the British Grand Prix. Starting it out with my first checkered flag has to be Nico Hülkenberg and Kick Sauber. Huge winners on the weekend, both as a team and as an individual driver. Nico Hülkenberg, he has the streak for the longest amount of time that it has taken an F1 driver to make it onto the podium. He's had an amazing career in Formula One, but has always just been in kind of a midfield team and never really had much opportunity to fight at the front. And so his opportunity to get on a podium has been limited. He has had a few shots, and funny enough, they've usually been in these kind of mixed weather, rainy conditions, and this just so happened to be another one of those where he was able to pull it out and get it P3 on the grid. So pretty impressive from Nico Hülkenberg, honestly, and Kick Sauber both. He started P19 on this grid today and brought that car all the way to P3. Obviously, a very great drive by Nico, paired with just really good strategy timing on his two-stop from Kick Sauber. So Nico Hülkenberg finally bringing home that podium. And also Kick Sauber jumping up to 6th place in the Constructors, having started as unanimously thought of as the worst constructor, worst car, worst team on the grid at the beginning of the season. And now they are well up into P6 in the Constructors. That's some valuable money at the end of the year that I'm sure they will be appreciative of as they go into this new series of regulations under Audi and have to build an entirely new car. Moving over, though, into my first blue flag of the weekend, and that's Oscar Piastri. Now, you may say, how can Oscar Piastri be one of my top losers on the weekend? He got second place in the GP. He extended his lead to Max Verstappen, all of that. But crucially, he lost quite a bit of points to his teammate Lando Norris, who at this point is really his only competitor in the World Drivers' Championship. Max Verstappen was pretty much, I would say, knocked out of the championship after last weekend, and I think after this weekend, it just put him even further back. So unless there's an absolute miracle in the back half of the season, granted it's long, anything can happen. You know, we saw McLaren close the gap significantly a couple years ago, but that just doesn't look like it's going to happen this year. And Lando is really his main competitor. And having chipped away 7 points last weekend with the victory, and then having chipped away another 7 points this weekend, especially on a weekend where Oscar looked so quick all weekend, looked really quick during the GP itself, really looked like no one was going to be able to challenge him on sheer pace, and he should have easily won that GP. Having Lando come out on top and chip away another 7 points and close that gap to the World Drivers' Championship, I think that puts Oscar definitely on one of my biggest losers on the weekend, even though ironically he had a great weekend and finished second place in the GP. Which brings me over into my next checkered flag, which is Aston Martin and their double points finish. So this is the first double points finish that they've had all season. They've had the chance to double points finish a few times, but Fernando Alonso has been pretty unlucky with some DNFs, and so it just really hasn't panned out. They haven't had both drivers put it together in the same weekend. Lance has had some good drives in the wet. This was another good drive in the wet, and Fernando was able to put it together as well, even though Fernando had some woes over the radio from a strategy perspective, and even Lance Stroll commented on the car being undrivable at the end of the GP. But at the end of the day, both of them were up in the points. And so I'm putting Aston Martin as one of my big checkered flag winners on the weekend. Which brings me over into my next blue flag, which is Mercedes. We talked about this during my last race review. I thought Mercedes was a big loser last weekend after having such an incredible GP in Canada. I think they are a big loser again this weekend because, well, one, their string of form hasn't been good the last couple of GPs. You know, Antonelli DNFing in this GP, not necessarily his fault, but we'll get into some maybe strategy decisions that put him in a compromised position, which is, you know, deciding to pit him during that early safety car, putting him back on the grid, and then, just putting him in the compromised position back there, which resulted in Hadjar running into him. Not necessarily Hadjar's fault. You know, you look at that onboard, he couldn't see Antonelli. He just appeared out of nowhere. But unfortunately, Mercedes put Antonelli in that position. And that's not even to talk about all of the things that happened with Russell. Deciding to pull Russell in after the formation lap, have him start from the pit lane on slicks. That did not pan out at all. As we saw, they lost quite a bit of ground. And then basically everybody in front of them got a free pit stop later on. And then also putting Russell on slicks early at the end of the race, and Russell having that big moment where he spun and went off. How much of that is to blame Mercedes? Because Russell was essentially asking for it, and Russell has a history of asking for these sorts of things, and sometimes it's panned out and sometimes it hasn't. This is one of those where it hasn't, but at the end of the day, I can't put it fully on Mercedes, although the initial call, I didn't hear Russell ask for that. Maybe he did, but that was likely on Mercedes. But even on the end, when the driver asks for something, they are the ones who, you know, have all the data, can see all of the other cars, and are the ones who make the final decision there, and they put their stamp of approval. And that did not pan out at all. And so Russell finishing back P10 and Antonelli not finishing at all, just not a great weekend for Mercedes, especially when they're at a cooler circuit where their car should have performed very well this weekend. So putting them as one of my blue flags. Which brings me over into my next checkered flag, which is the other McLaren driver. So I have one McLaren driver on a blue flag and the other one on a checkered. So obviously my checkered is Lando Norris. One, winning his home GP, which he made the comment that he would trade all of his other victories that he's had to win his home GP. And he finally got that this weekend in front of his home crowd. On top of that, being able to chip away another 7 points to Oscar in the championship battle. And so overall, a really good weekend for Lando Norris. And that brings me over into my last blue flag, which unfortunately is my Ferrari boy, Leclerc. So Leclerc had a rough weekend. He typically, I feel like, doesn't do that well in wet weather conditions. Hamilton even commented that the Ferrari is a hard car to drive in wet weather conditions and doesn't really like it, which I guess makes sense because the Ferrari is described as being very oversteery, and that's probably not the best formula that you would want in wet weather conditions. While it might work in the dry, you know, I'm assuming it probably makes it quite difficult in the wet, and Hamilton commenting on that. But Leclerc seeming to never have a great wet weather drive, at least that I can remember. And this was another one. But even before the wet weather drive and the mixed conditions, Leclerc just looked like he was on the back foot when compared to his teammate Lewis Hamilton all weekend. Now, granted, Lewis Hamilton is fantastic around the circuit, but this is one of the first weekends of the year, maybe the first one since China, where it really looks like Leclerc was the slower of the two Ferrari drivers. Some bad strategy decisions that were made throughout the race, one of which being the early pit stop during the formation lap, putting him pretty far back from the leaders. But it wasn't just strategy. It wasn't just the car. He made his own mistakes too with a couple offs, one very big off that caused him to lose a lot of time and then finishing outside the points. So super tough weekend for Charles. Unfortunate to see that, and definitely landing on my blue flag list as a result, which brings us over into my next section, which is if the gap exists. So my top overtakes, and my first one is Piastri versus Verstappen. So the crucial overtake that happened around lap 8, I believe it was, Piastri looked like he was lining it up for a while. Verstappen you could tell his tires were wearing down. He was losing the rear end. He had no grip and was really starting to struggle. And Piastri was able to follow really close behind him in the dirty air, even in the wet, and just looked extremely quick. Piastri being able to finally make that move when DRS opened up and bring himself into the victory, which also allowed him to open up a sizable gap to his teammate Lando Norris, as Lando was stuck battling behind Max for a little while before Max made his mistake. And then unlucky for Lando as well that then his team made a mistake during the pit stop, which allowed Max back out in front of him. All of this didn't really matter because at the end of the day, a safety car came out and kind of neutralized the gaps anyway, but a crucial overtake by Piastri at a crucial time and just really showed the pace that he had on the weekend. Moving over into my next top overtake, which would be Hamilton v. Ocon v. Russell. So this was the overtake where Ocon was on some intermediate tires that were beginning to wear down and was kind of dropping through the grid right before they reached Ocon. Russell did put a move on Hamilton, and then Hamilton was able to put a move on the outside of both Russell and Ocon as they were battling. It almost looked like they collided. Specifically, it almost looked like Ocon and Hamilton were going to collide. Hamilton didn't have much room to put that around the outside, but he was able to put it around the outside. He was able to make a clean move, and that was definitely a send past both of them. Took a lot of bravery to be on the brakes on the outside like that, especially knowing that I don't even know that Ocon was looking for that sort of move from Hamilton, who was coming from 2 cars back. But absolutely fantastic move by Hamilton. Also super important because it was allowed him once again to open up a bit of a gap to Russell, who up until that point was challenging him on pace, although the track started to evolve shortly after and Russell's pace fell away and Hamilton's began to open up. And then my last top overtake is Hulkenburg. So super critical overtake. Hulkenburg was being held up for a bit. Lewis Hamilton was on the charge from behind, closing the gap at an extremely fast pace. Hulkenburg had to make that move as quick as possible in order to try to secure some sort of gap to Hamilton to be able to put himself on the podium. So P3, but critically held up Lewis Hamilton, allowing Hulkenburg to run in free air and open up a big enough gap that at the end of the day allowed Hulkenburg to stay P3 at the end of the race because he was able to hold out that 5-6 second gap to Lewis Hamilton over the closing stint of the race. So super critical overtake by Hulkenburg at a critical time. And that closes out my top overtakes for the British GP. And so we will be moving over into my next section on the stewards room, my top incidents to review of the GP. And the first incident that I will be reviewing that I have to kick off obviously has to be the Verstappen v Piastri incident behind the safety car. It's really hard for me to get a read of what actually happened here. There's the version of it where you can see Piastri accelerating down the straightaway. The safety car lights go off. Max starts to accelerate, and then Piastri slams on the brakes, causing Verstappen to move to the right and end up overtaking Piastri, which ultimately caused the incident to be reviewed and deemed to be a 10-second penalty for Oscar, which even if it should have been a penalty, which I can see why it should have been, a 10-second feels pretty harsh for an incident like that, especially after the Canada GP where something not exactly the same but similar happened and it was decided that there would be no penalty. So going from no penalty to a 10-second, I felt like a 5-second would have been more fair here, but unfortunately a 10-second was awarded. Now, on the flip side, also, Oscar Piastri says that the safety car light going off was just bad timing and that he didn't do it on purpose after the light went off. He was just doing what he had done for the 5 laps prior, which is accelerating and hitting the brakes in that section of the track to put heat into the rotors. Is that true? Is that not true? It's hard to say. Drivers are always going to kind of make up a story retroactively to advocate for their case. I wasn't able to see if he was actually doing that the 5 previous laps and if the timing was just unlucky. I can't necessarily blame Piastri for what happens after, but Max Verstappen ends up losing the rear end on the restart and losing a bunch of positions. Now, you could argue that was because Piastri did this and Verstappen was in his head and was distracted and caused him to make that mistake. I don't know that I completely agree with that. While I think that might have been the case, I think Verstappen might have been distracted because of the incident, and that caused him to make the error that he did. I don't know that we can blame Piastri for that at all, because Max is a 4-time world champion. Max is an absolute wizard behind the wheel, and if he was distracted by an incident like that caused him to make a mistake, I have to blame that more on Max than Piastri, even if it's unfortunate that it happened. So I don't really know where I land on this. I think if I made the call, I'd maybe say no penalty or 5-second penalty for Piastri. I do think that 10 seconds is too harsh, but I can see the argument for the penalty, especially given that the mixed weather conditions could make slamming on the brakes like that pretty dangerous. In Canada, at least it was in the dry. But yeah, super unfortunate for honestly both Max and Oscar in that situation, and Lando ends up being the big winner of it as Max takes himself out from in front of Lando, and then Oscar essentially defaults his way out because of the 10-second penalty that has to be taken during the pit stop. So unfortunate to see the race play out, but, you know, Lando ends up being a big winner of it. Arguably also, it's what led to Hulkenburg being on the podium. So there are some silver linings to that story, which brings me over into my next incident, which is Hadjar v. Antonelli. So Hadjar has been on an unlucky kind of run of performance, or not unlucky, but just poor run of performance the last couple of GPs after starting out his rookie campaign extremely strong. I still think that he, out of all of the rookies, taking in all the performance, is the rookie of the year at the moment, but especially because Antonelli's had plenty of his own mistakes. Bortoleto has plenty of his own mistakes. I mean, look, he crashed out of the race today. Antonelli's DNF wasn't really his fault. But yeah, Hadjar on a rougher string of performance, and kind of seems like his hot start to the season needs to be restarted again. Unfortunate for Hadjar, because from the onboard, you really couldn't see, like, you could not see Antonelli. All of a sudden, you just see spray, and then Antonelli appear out of nowhere, and Hadjar just ends up clobbering into the back of him, ruining Antonelli's diffuser, causing the DNF, and Mercedes, at the end of the day, with some of their strategy decisions, arguably at fault for even putting Antonelli in that part of the field and allowing him to be in an area where the back of the grid, middle of the grid, these things seem to happen a bit more. So impactful incident for both Mercedes, Antonelli, Hadjar, and Racing Bulls, which brings me over into my last top incident to review of the race, which is Ocon v. Behrman. So another interesting one and impactful. Interesting because it's always interesting anytime two teammates are racing each other and end up colliding. That never goes well. The pit wall's never happy. It creates animosity within the team. Behrman trying a fairly aggressive dive down the inside and ending up pushing a little bit wide and running into Ocon. I would say Behrman doesn't really have the best history on wet weather drives. It seems like he ends up off the track, in the wall, into other people a lot during mixed weather conditions or rainy conditions. So I kind of had a feeling that Behrman might struggle this weekend given the weather. He actually did a lot better than expected, though, because he ended up finishing P11 even after that incident. And had that incident not happened, you could make the strong argument that he would have finished in the points, having only finished 2 seconds off of George Russell, who was in 10th. Also, you could make an argument that Ocon may have finished in the points had that incident not happened, because Ocon finished back only 7 seconds from Russell. So both of them within a close margin, and obviously lost a lot of time when they ran into each other. Unfortunate incident, and going to be an interesting and uncomfortable probably breakdown after the race between the team and everyone involved in that wrap up. Which brings me to a close for the stewards rooms, my top incidents, and brings me into my next section, the pit wall. So strategy wins and blunders. My top strategy win for the British GP has to be Nico Hülkenberg and Kick Sauber. There wasn't anything necessarily crazy about their strategy. They did a standard 2-stop strategy. It was just they perfectly timed each of those stops to give Hulkenberg an optimal release from the pit. And he was able to capitalize on that. Yes, he did have an absolutely great drive as well, making overtakes on the track, but being kind of boosted by perfectly timed pit stops really helped his race, moving him from P19 to P3 on the grid. Like I said, nothing crazy about the strategy itself. It's just the timing was impeccable. And so he is my big winner on the weekend, which moves over into my strategy blunders, which is Mercedes and Ferrari. To start it out with Mercedes, even Toto Wolff said that they made a just terrible strategy decisions during this race, from the formation lap pulling George Russell in to start from the pit lane on hard compound slick tires that did not fire up, that ended up giving the front runners a free pit stop because they lost so much time just sliding around the track on slick tires. And then on top of that, seeing that happen and pulling Antonelli in early during the first safety car when nobody else really came in, at least out of the front runners, and putting him on slicks after seeing Russell struggle out there, which then kind of shuffled Antonelli down the grid, put him arguably in a position later in the race where he was at the back and Hadjar ran into him. Had they not done that, Antonelli probably would have finished the race. And then later on with George Russell, pitting him from P7 early for slicks once again. Granted, Russell was pushing for that decision, but they allowed it to happen, causing Russell to go off, lose ground, and then ends up finishing P10 on the race. Just overall, a lot of errors in the strategy decision that put the Mercedes drivers in compromised positions. And then you have Ferrari, who did some similar things. So Ferrari pitting Leclerc from the formation lap, same as Russell, same exact thing happening. So not much more to recap there, because I already went over it with what happened with Russell. But then on top of that, even Hamilton talking about the strategy decisions and the inopportune times that they pulled him in to stop, allowing him to get undercut, shuffling him from P4 to P8, and then Hamilton having a pretty good drive and able to make up those positions and bring him back into P4. But had that not happened, Hamilton would have likely finished on the podium. Unfortunately, that would have been bad for Nico Hülkenberg's campaign. But when looking at it solely through the lens of Lewis Hamilton and their strategy, it just was not timed as well as it could have been, and ruining Lewis Hamilton's streak of podium finishes at his home GP. So unfortunate to see that, but overall still a pretty solid performance out of Lewis Hamilton on the weekend, even if he didn't finish on the podium. Which brings me into my last section of the podcast, which is cockpit banter, my top radio messages. So there was a few interesting radio messages this GP, but the two that stood out the most to me, kicking it off, is Fernando Alonso saying all the people that we lost places, they have worse tires, or we just lose places for fun. So Fernando Alonso with another cheeky comment to his race engineer. He's had one seemingly every single week for the last few GPs and a lot over his career, but you can hear the frustration that he's having with Aston Martin strategy decisions and a lot of the things that they've been doing over the course of this year. And Fernando Alonso constantly having to dig himself out of the positions that they put him in. And then bringing me over into my last radio message to review, which is George Russell, when he says, depends how brave you want to be. We're running P7. And his engineer responds, brave, but not suicidal. We're still looking. Pretty ironic radio message, given that a lap or two later, Russell radios back and says, I think we go for it. The track is in even better condition at that point. They go for it. And then Russell essentially immediately goes off the track because it just was not ready for slicks. The race engineer turned out to be right. It was suicidal. But that closes out my section on top radio messages and my race review for the British GP. Stay tuned later this week as I will be doing my driver ratings, and a couple special episodes as well on some recent F1 stories that have been circling around the grid. Stay tuned for those. If you enjoyed the episode, give it a like, a subscribe, a follow, and I will catch you all in a couple days.